And in your first chapter, you have a very interesting theory on how these creative associations may have come about. I know you mentioned that it might be the chapter that Muslims find the most offensive, but personally, I didn't find it offensive at all. It actually turned my attention towards something that concerning revelation or the science behind it, I just have not even thought about. I mean, as you mentioned in your book, in the Quran, it says God sends the rain. We know that there's science behind that, but similarly, God sends down revelation. There must be a science behind that. So what prompted you to start your book off with that chapter? I mean, was it a conclusion you came to after writing the book, and that first chapter was at the end of you wrote the first chapter at the end of writing the book and you stuck it in the beginning because maybe, I just tried to put myself in your mindset on what you were thinking when you wrote the first chapter.
Yes, actually, you are absolutely right. The first chapter was actually written the very last. and the reason is because as I was trying to present the method of intertextual polysemy to many of my colleagues who were giving me lots of excellent feedback, one of the most important questions that they were bringing up: why is the Quran even like a puzzle? Like, they're telling me, the way that the method you're using of intertextual polysemy, it's like it's like a puzzle that you're trying to put together. So why is the Quran even written in such a puzzle that you would want to put together? And so that basically got me thinking. Right, like, why would the Quran want to be like that? What's the reason? And I found that perhaps from a scientific perspective, when we look into the neuropsychology of how the mind works and how the brain works, then maybe once we understand that, once we try to understand, as sometimes in literature they would call the authorial intent, which is actually what you're just doing with me. You're trying to find my authorial intent on how I put the first chapter.
So I'm kind of frame the question that way.
Yes. So I'm trying to find, so basically, when we want to find, okay, what is the intent of the author of the Quran? Whoever, of course, the author of the Quran, if you think of it to be God, or if you think about it of if the Prophet had some kind of an agency towards it, or anything like that. But regardless, what is the author's intent by making this puzzle? And so from what I found, that from a neuropsychological perspective, that the thing, if we think about, if a person had what we might sometimes call low latent inhibition, then people with low latent inhibition, they will be able to see things and the relationship between things that other people typically don't have. Now, what is actually low latent inhibition? Well, latent inhibition, generally speaking, is usually when you teach your mind something, like if you have a specific thing and you teach your mind something, that's it. Your mind associates it with that thing and never needs to associate it with anything else. That's it. This association is made, full stop. And that's typical to any mind to have something like that. However, people with low latent inhibition, in which perhaps they reach certain kind of an altered state of consciousness, which causes low latent inhibition in their minds, whenever they see a thing that they are very familiar with, but their mind still thinks about it as something that is not familiar, and it can easily be reassociated with something else. So to give an example, like some people might have watched the movie A Beautiful Mind, which is really a very beautiful movie. And it's a very old movie. I think it's been now out for, maybe about 20 years or so. something like that. I think so. But in any case, the beautiful mind is really a story. It's the biography of a very well-known mathematician by the name of John Nash. And he was a Nobel laureate in economics. And if you watch the movie, you will realize that when John Nash was first having these kind of altered states of consciousness. Let's not even call it psychotic episodes. Let's just call it altered states of consciousness. He would actually put things in relationship with one another, even though when in reality, they're not truly related with one another. And this is very typical to people with schizophrenia. So people with schizophrenia, it's very typical for them to put things together that most people would think like, why are you making this related to that? It makes no sense. And that's because in their mind, to their mind, it makes perfect sense to make these kinds of relationships that others don't see because of the low latent inhibition in their minds. Now, of course, if you have an individual who has low latent inhibition, but above average intelligence, then they can act as their own filter. Because again, low latent inhibition is when the brain is no longer filtering out many of these relationships that's going on. But a person who has above average intelligence and low latent inhibition, they can act as their own filter. Whenever they will see things that are not related with one another and that making these kinds of relationships makes absolutely no sense, they will filter it out, even if their brain is no longer able to filter it out, but their intelligence is able to filter it out and say, no, this relationship makes no sense, ignore it. But their mind, because of their above average intelligence, they could basically be seeing relationships and say, oh, this relationship perhaps makes sense. And this is what causes creativity. And John Nash perhaps is one of the individuals who perhaps had low latent inhibition, and perhaps that's one of the reasons he was highly creative. Because he was highly intelligent and was able to be very creative, because his mind was able to see things that other people weren't able to see. But he was so intelligent that he was able to find wonderful and excellent relationships between them. And so basically, a person who has low latent inhibition, but highly intelligent, very, very intelligent, they become very, very creative. And so to them, when they make these relationships, to them, it's very natural. Oh, I can see it. And so why don't you see it? Why don't you see what I see? And actually, when we read the Quran, we do see many times in the Quran what appears some kind of a frustration. Like sometimes like God says to the Prophet, for example, and in the Quran, well, don't be frustrated. Don't be frustrated. Why? Because sometimes God puts veils in people's hearts that they wouldn't understand the Quran. Maybe those veils is this latent inhibition. I have no idea. but you see, to the Prophet, even if he was passively receiving the Quran, to him, he completely understood it. Yeah, it makes sense. It's not jumbled up. It makes perfect sense to him. It's very natural to him. But to the other people, they didn't see what he saw. So whether he was an agent in the Quran, or even if he was passively receiving the Quran, perhaps what was happening in his mind is that he did have some kind of low latent inhibition. However, he was perhaps very highly intelligent. And so to him, all of those relationships made perfect sense. And he was very frustrated why the other people didn't understand what he was trying to say. And so maybe simply said, well, maybe those people have veils in their hearts that even when it's right in front of your face, they wouldn't even be able to see it.